Welcome everyone to episode 3 of Red Alert. Today, my guest is Phil Kay, the chair of Belfast Cuba Support Group. Phil, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So, Phil, just today, what I'd really like to talk to you, in previous episodes, we've talked about the concept of the essential workers who this pandemic is hitting very hard, the ones who are carrying our society forward. And in the second episode, we talked about the global economic situation, the bailouts being requested by the very, very wealthy. What I'd really like to talk to you today about is the international sort of stage, and particularly the Cubans' efforts in the international stage, and how they have been sending teams of doctors, medics, nurses, and PPE equipment around the world. This is something I know that you'd have a lot of experience working with ambassadors and Cubans and such. So do you want to tell me a bit about the Cuba Support Group first and foremost, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the discussion?
Certainly. So working with Belfast Cuba Support Group, the Cuba Support Group Ireland is an all-island solidarity group. It really kind of came to prominence around the campaign to release the Cuban 5. But now we're really find ourselves having to up our activities in light of the increasing severity and aggression of the US blockade against Cuba. So, you'll be aware that the sanctions and the blockade have actually become even more restrictive around Cuba, and the American regime is really pursuing a very red-blooded strategy of regime change across Latin America, whether that be removing governments through constitutional irregularities or actually just threatening full-scale military intervention. So yes, our campaign is really based around trying to break that blockade, build international awareness. You'll know yourself that at the United Nations, this illegal and inhumane blockade on Cuba is rejected by the overwhelming majority of countries. Just 3 countries last year voted to uphold those sanctions and blockades, and that was, of course, the United States and their puppet allies, Israel and the Brazil of Bolsonaro. So that's the thrust of our campaign, but we're also really keen to build awareness of struggles happening throughout Latin America. So the recent events in Venezuela, which is really the kind of headline of the US regime change strategy, and also with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then, against the coup in Bolivia, and in support of the people rising up in Chile and other countries against kind of the failure of neoliberalism. So it's a big ask, but we see events in Latin America as very much the front line in a global struggle against neoliberalism. And we want people here to be aware of that and understand that struggle is part of our struggle too.
And that seems to be, that's a very common thing on the left in general, is whenever you start to passionately care about the well-being of working class people in one country, you tend to care very passionately about that international situation, because you see that battle that you're talking about. And so I find that whenever I meet people who are showing global solidarity with perhaps the Sandinistas, or with what Cuba has been through, or any of these very different struggles going on around the world, they tend to feed into one another and to build that really global network of global solidarity, as we would know it. And I know that you're, as well as being supportive on Cuban issues and Cuban democracy and Cuban solidarity, that you're also very active on supporting and upholding the revolutionary socialist efforts in Nicaragua and other countries as well. And what we've seen in, as you mentioned, Brazil, the turning of Brazil into this sort of proto-fascist state with Bolsonaro, who could just make dictates and edicts at will. It's worrying, but I think within the broader society, a lot of these international global solidarity issues are not really very widely known about. But certainly with the COVID pandemic and what's happening there, we've seen a lot of attention on China, both for it being sort of where the virus was first had its first outbreaks, but also because they have also sent a lot of attention, a lot of PPE, a lot of doctors, a lot of support. They've sent them to Italy, they've sent them to around Europe, they've sent them to other countries as well. And so I think a lot of people are seeing that effort, but they're also, I think a lot of people are seeing now for the first time, the Cubans' approach to socialized medicine and to international solidarity, because the Cubans have also been sending teams of doctors around the world. I was actually looking it up. They have although I think they've sent in their history, since this program started in, I think, the early 60s, they have sent medical teams of doctors and nurses and staff to about 140 something different countries. But just for this COVID situation alone, they've sent teams to 21 different countries. I'm just going to actually, I've got it here. I'm just going to read it out very quickly. They've sent doctors, nurses, and health advisors to more than 20 countries: Italy, Andorra, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Suriname, Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Antigua, Barbuda, Belize, St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, Haiti, Barbados, Qatar, Angola, South Africa, and Honduras, and undoubtedly by the time of this, more. That is a huge effort. That is a lot of different doctors and nurses. That's well over 1,000 doctors and nurses, treating thousands upon thousands of different people, no doubt, and providing vital medical expertise. It's got noticed in the press to a certain degree. It's definitely got noticed in terms of social media, where people are sharing the videos of them leaving and arriving in different countries. It's got noticed to the point where I think this week a French NGO has nominated them for a Nobel Peace Prize. So I did a bit of reading about this. It's not the first time that the Cuban International Medical Brigades have been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. They were nominated in 2015 by Norwegian trade unions for their fight in West Africa, fighting Ebola and trying to save lives there. So that's unusual. I think anyone would recognize that's quite unusual. Within a lot of the countries we're seeing, you might see PPE maybe being donated. More often it's sold. But the Cubans have this history going back to the 60s of sending doctors and nurses where they're needed most, and training people up, both within Cuba and their own home countries. So where does that come from? Why is socialized medicine? Because we're really proud of our socialized medicine, even though it's never called that. But like we have a socialist inspired, if nothing else, health system where it's not just you're on your own. You put money into the pot gets shared out, and by doing so, you're able to lower prices by buying in bulk. You're able to organize a social health system. So tell me a bit about Cuba's social health system, its attitude to socialist medicine, and then perhaps why it is not confining that to Cuba, it's sending people abroad.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just outlined there, when you sit back and think about the numbers and the commitment, it's astonishing when you remember this is a tiny island of approximately 11 million people, 90 miles off the shore of a global superpower, which despises them and which has them encircled by a blockade and sanctions. So where does that come from? I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, Adam, to anyone that's heard me speak on this topic before, I would go back to a young Argentinian medical graduate traveling around Latin America. What he witnessed was that people were dying because of a lack of basic health care. And it wasn't just because Latin America was full of unhealthy people. What was really unhealthy about the societies through which the young Ernesto Guevara was traveling was that the system was killing people. The system that they lived under, the brutal exploitation of workers. And he witnessed this, and it radicalized him, and it brought clarity to his revolutionary vision. And that trip around Latin America really galvanized his thought to understand that you had to now fight a revolutionary fight against the forces of imperialism to free that continent, to free humanity. And as somebody who's not religious, who's somebody who doesn't believe in fate or destiny, I do marvel at the forces that brought Ernesto Guevara and Fidel Castro together in Mexico, and put Che Guevara on the Granma boat that traveled to Cuba to start the revolution. And it was those two forces coming together, two exceptional individuals who were propelled by a principle, and that principle was humanity, about fighting a fight for the benefit of humanity. And if you look at the early days of the struggle in Cuba, in the Sierra Maestra, the liberated rebel zones, there's two things that immediately happened in those areas. Was that they would set up education for the peasants and the peasants joining the rebels, and also basic healthcare. And I think I've told you before about stories of people queuing, local people queuing to meet Ernesto Guevara because they just wanted to see what a doctor looked like. So those principles are the founding principles, very much the center, the core of the Cuban Revolution. After the success of the revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro brought that vision. And, the quick wins that you could do for a society would be to take literacy campaigns out into the rural areas, because uneducated people are a much more difficult people to cheat, to lie to, which is the modus operandi of the imperialists, the colonialists, and also to bring them basic health care. And kind of force of necessity around a small country that doesn't have unexhaustible resources was that the Cuban medical strategy was built on pragmatism. And what could you do if you don't have access to the kind of cutting edge of medicine? The key thing that underlines Cuban medicine is prevention, meaning that people can see a doctor when they need it, from early intervention before diseases become chronic. And that has really been the bedrock of the Cuban medical revolution. Now, those principles, as Fidel Castro argued, were not principles to be held only for the Cuban people. But one thing that when you study or you learn with Cuban revolutionaries is I have never met a people who understand the depth and range and breadth of the word solidarity. It's a lived experience in the Cuban people. And that meant from the very, very earliest days of the revolution, Cuba was a country that wanted to help. So from when we talk about medical internationalism, I think the first big test of that was in 1963 when Chile suffered a devastating earthquake. And Cuba was a first responder. And that set in chain then the kind of Cuban medical internationalism that has spread throughout the world. So when you think about the Cuban commitment to Africa, not only was it about helping national liberation movements or fighting the apartheid army of South Africa in Angola, but it was also about taking to those countries doctors and teachers and really helping, expand and export the principles of the revolution, not as some kind of, big win for Cuba, but really about sending help where it was needed. You mentioned also there, one of the things that came to the public attention a couple of years back was the Ebola crisis. And Ebola was devastating West Africa. Yet again, the first responder was the Cuban medical missions, who were the first in, last out. And to this day, there's Cuban medical missions serving throughout Africa. And also, if you remember Hurricane Katrina, where when the US was hit, Cuba offered help. Now, it was declined by America because their ego wouldn't accept such an offer. But, nonetheless, help was offered. And I think if you look at what this does is it really sends seeds, it sows seeds of solidarity across the world, because countries that have been served by Cuban medical missions know the benefit of having those Cubans in their country. So I'll give you one example. Shortly after Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela, he met with Fidel Castro and he wanted very immediately to help alleviate the worst extremes of poverty. And over conversations with Fidel Castro, they said, if you go into the barrios, the poorest areas of Venezuela, poverty is life-limiting. But if you're blind due to cataracts in such a situation, then that's a death sentence. And a cataracts operation is a fairly simple operation. But, thousands of Venezuelans were dying long before their time because they'd lost their eyesight and they were living in abject poverty. So Cuba sent medical missions to Venezuela, and they started up eye clinics, and they started restoring the eyesight of the poorest people. And that gave them immediately new life chances. And then coupled with education and a rise of other social programs from the Bolivarian Revolution, it changed people's lives very quickly. Now, immediately you'll notice there's an anti-Cuban propaganda that always arrives. Wherever Cuban doctors go, the anti-Cuban propaganda arrives soon after. And one of the arguments that the opposition made in Venezuela at the time to Hugo Chavez was, this is electioneering. This is all about PR. You are doing these cataract operations just to score points. And Chavez's response was was perfect. He said, why didn't you do it? You've been in power for decades. If it's a cheap PR ploy, easy done. Why did you not do it? We're doing it. And then if you look, Cuba also sent these medical missions about restoring eyesight across Latin America, and to Evo Morales when he was in power in Bolivia. And here's an example of Cuban humanitarian principles. In 2007, in rural Bolivia, a peasant arrived at a Cuban medical mission suffering severe cataracts, could no longer see his family, his grandchildren, could no longer enjoy watching football on TV. He had his eyesight restored. His son wrote a letter to the Cuban authorities thanking them, and he explained that the man whose eyesight had been restored was a man called Mario Turan. Mario Turan lives in infamy because he is the man in 1967 who volunteered to kill Che Guevara. And the Cubans responded by saying, it doesn't matter who this man is, because we will give help wherever and to whomever needs it. And that's why they've offered help to their enemy, the United States of America, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And another example there would be, as the pink tide has eroded in Latin America, Cuban doctors have been attacked. You mentioned there Bolsonaro and his fascist regime in Brazil. One of the first things he did in coming to power was make it impossible for the Cuban medical brigades to work in that country. And they've been serving there for quite some time in the poorest, most marginalized communities. And when those thousands of Cuban doctors were forced out of the country, it left, and this is staggering, it left 28 million Brazilians without access to basic medical care. When COVID-19 struck, Bolsonaro started looking for ways to try and get the Cuban medical doctors back into his country. So it tells you everything you need to know. But yeah, so when COVID-19 struck, it was natural that Cuba would offer help where it was needed. I mean, the revolution over the decades that it's been in power, you've now got to think around 10 doctors to every 1,000 Cuban inhabitants. And that means that preventative healthcare system that I talked about is well established. So they send these brigades, the Henry Reed brigades, wherever they're needed. And, we're used to seeing Cuban medical brigades serving throughout Latin America. We're very used to seeing them serving throughout Africa. But I think one of the striking images was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Italy became the epicenter of this global crisis. And, the images of Cuban doctors arriving in Italy, getting off that plane and going straight to the front line was, I think, about as heroic a symbol that you will see. They're also serving in Andorra. And, again, in the midst of this, America, who is not sending help across the world, who's actually stealing shipments of PPE for Caribbean countries, for European countries, they're still selling the propaganda about Cubans. I think a lived reality, or certain many Europeans have a lived reality. You can look at the US propaganda, and you can look at the actual lived reality that Cuban doctors are arriving where they're needed and getting stuck in with one simple mission: to save lives. And another example of this solidarity, of commitment to humanitarianism, wasn't spoken in the BBC, but it had to be mentioned in the House of Commons by Dominic Raab, was when a British cruise ship inflicted by COVID-19 with COVID-positive passengers on board was refused safe harbour in the Caribbean, refused safe harbour in the United States of America. And the one country that said they would bring this ship in was Cuba. And they brought those passengers in, treated them, and then made sure they were repatriated to their country of origin. And the BBC seemed to act like this didn't happen. Many other media outlets, but it was mentioned in the House of Commons. And I think that is just another symbol of this commitment that we see that has stretched from the very first days of the revolution right up to today.
I think that cruise ship, the story about the cruise ship must have appeared at least in a small article on the BBC, because I did see something about it, or maybe it was in one of the newspapers. But it's really interesting, I think, that whenever you have something as big as that, like a cruise ship full of people from different parts of the world is in dire straits. They've got the virus on board. They need help. They're being turned away from various countries. The Cubans take them in, get them the medical care that they need, get them sorted out, put them up in hotels and houses and make sure that they're fed and watered and looked after. And then enables them to get home again. You're right. You would think that the media would be going straight to some sort of Cuban official or or even someone within the government of Cuba and saying, we really want to talk to you about this. This is so generous of you. Thank you so much. But why have you done this where other countries have turned away? But it is sort of like, it's almost begrudgingly acknowledged by some countries, like, well, thanks for that one. You're right. It was referenced in the House of Commons. It's been referenced by various different countries. And that's something you said there about sowing the seeds of solidarity. Seems to be like, it is hugely efficient, I think, as a way to show who you are as a people, to go out of your way to help other countries. And it's like chalk and cheese between the Cuban government and the US administration, as you've pointed out there. That and even there's something that springs to mind when I look at Cuba and I look at their international efforts to bring medical care and support to other places. They embed themselves down. You're right. It's not like they don't just pop in, do a little bit, take a photo op, and then fly home. It's like some of them put in really long stints in these countries. And it reminds me of Thomas Sankara, who, is a revolutionary leader in Africa, said, when people, they come and they just give us a bag of grain, that in a way that keeps us beholden to those people. And that's not really what we want. We want you to come, teach us how to use tractors and teach us how to farm, teach us how to irrigate, help us stand on our own 2 feet. And so it's interesting that whilst Cuba does, it does ship PPE and it does send doctors to do the immediate triage, it also embeds itself in those countries, delivers the training to locals, and also has, I believe, schools within Cuba whereby people can go to Cuba to learn to get their medical degrees and then take that home with them. And that's done in a totally unbegrudging, there's certain people in certain countries would say like, well, why would we have them? Why would we help do that? What does it profit us? What does it profit us? And that's not their attitude.
That's a key point that you raise, because yes, they send their medical brigades once they send their medical brigades where they're needed. But that's another important point that you raise. Cuba has many universities that specialize in medical training, medical degrees. They take thousands of students from the most impoverished countries of the world where they can study for free and graduate for doctors and take that expertise back to their countries of origin. And interestingly, there's quite a few students that travel from inner city areas of the United States of America, mainly Black students who just couldn't access a university degree in the United States.
Crushing medical debt.
Yeah,
the crushing medical debt they have to put themselves through to get out the other side of that.
And that's important because, while I started off by personalizing the kind of Cuban principles around medical humanitarianism through Che Guevara, on a side note of that, Che Guevara's daughter, Dr. Aleida Guevara, a regular visitor to Ireland, has served in medical missions across the world all her working life, and her own Che's own granddaughter, Celia Guevara, is currently serving in the front line of this pandemic in Cuba. But
really?
You're right. It's about extending those principles, that training, giving help where it's needed, and asking nothing in return. That's the fundamental principles that underpin the Cuban Revolution. And for any of your viewers who remember the TV drama Chernobyl, one thing that TV show just didn't mention was that in the wake of Chernobyl, it was Cuba that brought the kids who were worst affected through cancers, etc., to Cuba, where they were treated for free. No big PR exercise around it. It just happened. They were brought in, given the treatment they needed, and then could return home in good health. That, to me, is an astonishing legacy of this revolution that I think we're all rightly proud of.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the way that it's amazing what is known by people and what's not known by people. I didn't know that story, and I've done a lot of reading on the history of the USSR and the history of socialism in general. That's you're always learning something new. I think those of us on the left don't always celebrate our successes, and we don't boast so much about the things that we have done. In the way that Donald Trump, for example, would shake hands with someone and 50 news agencies will turn out to say, wasn't it brilliant that he went and did that? Whereas socialist governments around the world are treating millions of people, housing millions of people, ensuring that people are fed. I mean, I was in the run up to this interview, I was doing a little bit of studies, and I was really blown away by the fact that over 9 million people, I think, a year are still dying from hunger and hunger-related illnesses, and over between 1.5 and 2 million are dying because they haven't got access to clean enough drinking water, and also then you've got several million further that are dying from preventable diseases and things that, if you, as you say, if you just had the right treatment, the right medicines on hand, you could have solved that. It shouldn't be a death sentence in the modern age. And the way that it seems to me is that the way that is talked about and treated is as if that's just the natural state of the world. Well, the world's a tough place. It's a difficult place. Some countries have been run better than others. It seems the Western ones, the European ones and such, have all just had better leaders or something over the years, and there was no imperialist sort of period, and there was no ongoing consequences of that. It's shocking when you think about it. Some countries didn't get their independence until the mid 20th century, post World War II, things like that. They were previously colonial holds of European nations, and so whenever we're constantly bombarded with these messages that it's up to us to put money in the little bucket and say, well, we'll donate our money and stuff as charity, and that's good. I mean, I think that the countries who presently have very high levels of wealth comparatively to other countries in the global south, etc., should use some of that wealth in a charitable fashion to help other people. But that, when you look at the Cuban model, it's not charity, it's solidarity. And that's a word, unfortunately, since the end of the Cold War, perhaps has been talked about less and less internationally by people. But this idea that, even the European Commission, I think I read something today posted by the ones over at Trademark who I interviewed previously. The European Commission is investigating whether or not it can crowdfund the recovery from this COVID thing. So again, it's like, okay, everyone, put your hands in your pockets, give us something from your wage packet. And it's like, but the billionaires aren't paying their taxes, and they're doing everything they can not to bother to be involved in this. All these people who have been lecturing us for years, these celebrities and big billionaires and millionaires, telling us how we need to give generously. Where the hell are they now? They've someone like Elon Musk, someone oh God, his name's just popped in my head. The guy that runs Amazon, Bezos. They give 100 million out of their vast, 9-10 billion pot, and they say, well, that's my charity. But that's the equivalent of me flicking a penny at the problem. But the media hypes them up. Always, it's so wonderful that they're doing this, when they could single-handedly ensure that everyone has enough PPE and that there's enough doctors and all this without really having to break a sweat.
They don't want to reveal the card trick of capitalism, if you like. So the idea that in the immediate wake of this, there was money available. We were told, don't worry, there's money available. And that quickly changed to, well, it'll have to be paid back, because they were afraid, like at the end of The Wizard of Oz, the curtains had come back and everything that you're told about, there's only so much money, there's no magic money tree, actually becomes a lie. And, the response of these millionaires is not a humanitarian one. It's about looking after and maintaining their own wealth. And that's why you see the way the EU dealt with Italy, that the EU flag has been taken down in some local areas. It's been replaced by Russian flags, Chinese and Cuban flags, because people know where the help came from and they know where it didn't come from. So I think that's important, yeah.
And that's something I was talking about with Stevie from Trademark in the last episode, was that this is really, it has exposed very much that the European Union is not the project that it sells itself as. It's not the project of, we're all in this together and we're all equals. We're going to spread the burden and share the pain. It's very much about when the chips are down, it's us, it's you or me, in the European Union. It's, because there's European countries that have diverted PPE as well from on their way to like Italy, so I think some other companies have been reaching in and going, well, we'll give you double, give it to us now. There's very little solidarity in that sense.
They deal in dull platitudes, because they talk about, we're all in this together, and we're bombarded with videos of people from their Hollywood mansions telling us how to deal with lockdown. And you mentioned it earlier there, and it reminded me as well, when you're talking about these these great entrepreneurs as they're presented, and telling us how much they care and they're going to donate $1 million or whatever. It reminds me of how the narrative around the end of apartheid is spoken in the West. We in the West seem to think that a series of concerts by Paul Simon brought apartheid South Africa crashing down. And yet again, you have to go back, read the history and understand there was a huge Cuban commitment. The defeat of the South African army in Angola at Cuida in the late 1980s cannot be overstated in the fatal blow to that apartheid regime. Someone like Ronnie Kasrils, who in the early 60s set up the armed wing of the ANC, cites Cuba as the defining point in that struggle. But yet in the West, we are told it was a wealthy pop star, boycotting or this, that, and the other. In the same way, we're told that COVID can be dealt with by, elderly war heroes doing their bit for charity, or somebody donating $1 million for PPE. That's not how you deal with a crisis like this. And I think that's where we have to go back as socialists, as revolutionaries, to say you need a really revolutionary response to this kind of crisis, because not only for the human effect of the disease and the pandemic, but the weaknesses within neoliberalism or capitalism to deal with this exposes itself, and then the economy can't take it. So we need profound change after this to really deal with the what caused the depth of the crisis, which shouldn't have been as deep as it is.
I want to do a separate episode specifically looking at our own health service, the health services and the health service that so many are modeled on, the National Health Service in Britain that they have, that was created through struggle, that was created with opposition, and which, as I say, became the model for so many others. But I think there's something that ties into that, because we know we're people aren't stupid. They look around, they see the waiting lists going up, they see successive health ministers unable to deal with this crisis. I think I read something that said by 2030, if things just carry on the way they are in the north of Ireland, the entire Northern Ireland budget will need to be put into health to maintain current levels. And current levels aren't great, in terms of, I know many people who, for hernias or knee replacements, have been told, well, you can wait a year or more and just chance your luck with it. Like a hernia is not something you want to have any longer than you have it. But it's like, well, you can be put on a list and we'll get to you, or you can pay me or someone that I'm, someone else, a private doctor. You could pay up a couple grand on finance or whatever. I don't know if they have those options, but you can pay a couple grand and we'll do it for you next Tuesday. And that, I think a lot of people are looking at that going, we love socialized medicine. We love the National Health Service, the Health and Social Care Service here. We love the people who run that and do that. But I think people are increasingly becoming wise to the fact that it's not what it originally was. It's being undermined to the point of collapse. And it's so, how would you put it? It's just so depressing to watch it slowly play out. And I think that a part of the depression that I have felt watching it over the last 10 years is that it's always like defend the NHS, defend the NHS, defend the NHS. And I start to feel like I'm in, the 30s in Spain saying no pasaran to the fascists. I think there comes a point where you have to, certainly coming out of this, we have to, I think, be more forthright with our views and say, well, hold on a second, we're not just on a defensive footing here. We have a different attitude to those right-wing and centrist parties that see everything as a business opportunity. Everything is something that should be part of the market. We have a totally different attitude. It's more akin to what Cuba has. It's more akin to what the NHS was originally set up to be. It is a socialized socialist health system. I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from Cuba in this. What would you say there's like one big lesson that people should take away from the Cuban attitude towards healthcare?
Well, it's exactly as you summarized. It's, we're recording this on a Thursday, and tonight people will go outside their front doors and they will applaud for the NHS. And this is happening throughout many countries, but it's happening in the United Kingdom, that has just voted for the Tory government, who over the last decade have continued on from New Labour and accelerated the dismantling of the National Health Service. As you said, they've cut terms and conditions for doctors and nurses. They've cut the capacity of the NHS. That's one of the reasons why this crisis is so deep. in the UK. So I think what we as socialists need to say that there are principles that we believe in that are non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
And that everything that we do and everything that we argue for is underpinned by a deep sense of humanity. That is not to serve the interests of someone who wants to make profit, whether it be from healthcare, housing, or education, but because we as a human beings need these things as a society, and that we will defend those principles, non-negotiable, to the bitter end. And it's something that we will never compromise on, as you've seen with social democratic parties over decades that have, fallen into line with the neoliberal model you mentioned there, the EU, where so-called socialists within the EU are signed, sealed, and flag bearers for the neoliberal project. No, that's not good enough. So if Cuba instructs us, one thing is that you underpin everything you do by principles that cannot be broken and will not be broken. And hopefully, as we move beyond this crisis, humanity looks at who looked out for other people and who looked out for their bottom line, their profit margin.
That's certainly been where my own mind has been going over the course of this month and a half of lockdown, is that the more you look at it, or the way that I look at it, at least the more that I look at it, the more it comes down to, there is the side of politics that says it's about business and it's about money and it's about trying to make a buck, and then there's the side that says, well, actually, it's not that we're looking for a more humane way of doing that or whatever. We're looking for a nicer way to manage that. It's actually, no, do you know what? We reject that on principle. That whole, life is about profit and getting a big house, a big car, a yacht, and fuck anyone who gets in your way. We take a completely diametrically opposed view to that. We're about solidarity, socialism. We're about uniting people together. And there's one of the big problems, I think, with particularly with Britain, I would say, but I think it probably seeps into other European nations, is that post-colonial European exceptionalist idea that, well, of course our health service is the best health service in the world because it's ours, right? And we love it so much that it's the best. But it's like, even as it is undermined, underfunded, crippled, over in Britain, there, minister comes out and says, I've created a new lapel pin for care workers. It's like, they don't want a lapel pin. They want better frigging conditions and wages and better jobs, essentially. And within the health service as well, the very people who were standing on picket lines not even 2 months ago, fighting for wages, being slandered by Tories and such, are now being told, well, you're the saviors of our society and we all clap for you every Thursday. And the very people in our society who are being called essential are the very people who were underpaid, precarious hours, treated as unskilled laborers and easily replaceable. I feel like if we don't come out the other side of this with at least a lot more people, especially on the left, but we should try and get that message out beyond the left of saying, do you know what? There is definitely a line somewhere and it's being crossed on a weekly basis now. And that it's time to say, well, I know what side of that line I'm on, and it's the side of the people and making sure that everyone has enough. Because frankly, if they can have a health service that provides for everybody, that doesn't have the problems that our health service is experiencing, is not underfunded, is not long waiting lists, is not undermined constantly by private practitioners and people who want to privatize things, if they can do it, there's no reason that we can't do it, other than I think the illusion that we think we already have a great system and there's no, it baffles my mind. If we come out the other side of this and it goes back to normal again, I'll tear out what little hair I have left. Do you know what I mean? People say there's no going back, but I think for a lot of those people in politics, particularly the Tories, the ones with the business interests, they'd be more than happy for things to go back to normal and to say, here's a few badges and medals, and on you go back to your poor wages, etc.
Absolutely. There certainly will be a reorganization by the capitalist class. They know that capitalism is in crisis. It was before the pandemic. And they have time, and they'll not be sitting on their hands. They will be planning for how they structure society, how they can curtail our freedoms while keeping us as consumers. So yes, the challenge is there, as it always is. for us to find networks to collectivize, to come together. And that's why internationalism is important, because when you realize that it's not just about us, the self-made man or woman myth that we're perpetuates in the West as individuals in charge of our own destiny, but that we're part of a species living on a planet which is increasingly, its survival is increasingly threatened by capitalism, whether it's inability to deal with a pandemic because we don't invest enough in healthcare or antiviral drugs, or just simply the destruction of our natural environment. That is the system that is dominating the world at the minute. And I think that's why it's important to look at those countries who are standing against that tide and then ask the question, why are the countries that are standing against it saying, no, there is an alternative? Why are they subject to such aggression, blockades, sanctions from the United States of America? Not so much because of their natural resources, but because Cuba and countries like it represent an alternative, and that's much, much more dangerous.
That's the real danger.
A lot of people portray what's happening in Venezuela as a will-be war for oil. That's part of it. Let's not dismiss it. America wants the oil in Venezuela, but more importantly, it wants to crush the example that Venezuela sets to the rest of the Latin American continent. And that's why Bolivia, Evo Morales had to be pushed out of power. That's why someone like somebody as moderate as Lula in Brazil had to, be ensured his political career was sidetracked. That's why we've seen events in Ecuador, Honduras, anywhere where that spark of hope for humanity rises, the imperialist is there to crush it. So we as revolutionaries, as socialists living in the West, need to be in tune to that and understand that internationalism is critical, because we won't win our struggle if our comrades across the world don't win theirs.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting thing on Facebook at the moment going around where people take the imperialist actions of the United States, particularly the CIA, their efforts to undermine and dethrone socialism across the world, and then trying to trick people almost into reading about it. It's like, there was something I said, it was like, did you know the Americans have this wonderful bird sanctuary program? It's called Operation Condor. Look it up. It's like, it's great to see people finding new and creative ways to get that mess out there, because it's so deeply, deeply buried. And it reminds me of that thing that, you hear is like, socialism is such a failed ideology that the CIA has to keep whacking it down everywhere it starts to raise its head with assassinations and coups and government overthrows. That's because socialism's so bad that if people got a taste for it, they might frigging want it. And so we have to make sure that it doesn't get there. And that's right. The most dangerous thing is the idea that a different way is possible, and it doesn't keep us billionaires rich.
There's a phrase I think defines the moment that we're in, from the economic disaster that is neoliberalism, which is kind of collapsing and crisis, in the environmental, and that is that capitalism isn't compatible with the future. So, at the very purest, we have no future as a species with capitalism. So that asks of us to start coming up with really radical alternatives to this failed order that will drag us over the cliff, rather than give up 1 cent or $1 to the common good.
Well, this coming decade, I'm really glad that we've been able to try and get the podcast back up and running, because even with the difficulties of being online, because this decade is going to be a decade of challenges and instability. It's going to be, as you say, economic disturbances and collapses, more infrequent weather catastrophes, mass migration of people trying to get to places that are more temperate and can grow food, things like that. And I think this decade will offer up a lot of instability, which gives opportunities for those of us who have a different vision of the world. Unfortunately, it gives an opportunity to people whose vision is worse, the fascists and the likes that we're seeing, like Bolsonaro in Brazil and others. So, okay, well, look, this has been a really interesting conversation today. I hope that people who have stuck with it and had listened will go and look into the various articles that are floating around about Cuba and their efforts and socialized medicine. I'll do an episode soon, I think, about the history of the NHS and socialist ideals and principles that motivated that. But just the Cuba Solidarity Group, if people want to check it out, you're on Facebook, you're on Twitter.
Yeah, so you can check us out at Belfast CSG. And also my advice is wherever you're living, wherever you're watching this, get involved in your local Cuban Solidarity group. So we're the Cuba Support Group Ireland, but there's the Cuban Solidarity Campaign in the UK. Get involved, get active, because Cuba is owed an unpayable debt by the world. But the one little thing that we can do is start raising our voices and adding our voices together in opposition to that blockade and say no mass blockeo.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I can vouch for that. I've been to some of the CSG's events and sometimes there's rum. So can definitely advocate for that. Well, look, Phil, thanks so much for coming and talking to me. I'm sure that we'll talk to you again in time, hopefully in a studio with better connections. But thanks so much and take care.
Thank you.